It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Bill Rees of UBC's School of Community and Regional Planning. He's also a fellow of the Post-Carbon Institute. In 1990, Professor Rees co-developed the ecological footprint analysis, which allowed him to calculate the amount of productive land that would be required to support a given population. And based on that, he was able to say that North Americans use far more than our pro rata share of the world resources. In fact, he would say that somewhere between a quarter and a third of the ecological damage done to China is caused by North Americans. In case I run out of time, my takeaway point for Professor Rees is that it is, as Mark Twain said, it ain't so much what we know that gets us into trouble, it's what we know that just ain't so. His thesis is that man's biggest problem is that we are expansionist like any other life form, and accordingly, we will use resources until there are no more, while at the same time living with the myth that our resources are unlimited. His thesis reminds me of a t-shirt which says on the front, Earth first, and on the back, log the other planets after. Professor Rees unabashedly says that he has no intention of giving up the good things in life. But more importantly, he says that to allow us to do that, we must have a disaster that is big enough for us to change our myth of unlimited resources. I hope he will describe what type of disaster that might require, and whether we might be intelligent enough to dump our false myth without a great disruption. Please welcome me or join me in welcoming Professor Bill Rees from UBC. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, for that fine introduction. I'd like to thank Sam Sullivan and the Society for putting this on. I think it's a wonderful idea, and I can certainly understand why he wanted to get it out of his living room, but I don't have time for that. What I want to talk to you about is humanity's most significant environmental problem, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the environment. It's the human mind. Human beings have three qualities that distinguish them in particular from other species. The first is an unparalleled capacity for evidence-based reason and logical analysis. We have unmatched ability to extend compassion to other individuals and to other species. We have a unique capacity for forward planning to change our own future for the better. The problem is that when it comes to sustainability, we do none of these things. There is scarce evidence that we use any of our unique intellectual capacities to move us forward through the dilemma. And that's because other dimensions of human nature and nurture apply. The first is that we are an evolved species that shares with all other species two extremely important qualities that are subconscious. The first is that we tend to expand to fill all available habitat. We have by far the largest range of any advanced vertebrate animal on the planet. And secondly, Christine already alluded to it, we will use up all available or accessible resources. Other species do it, we just do it one hell of a lot better. The second part of this problem is that our biological predispositions are currently being reinforced by a cultural predisposition oriented to growth. So we remain a myth-making species, and at present global society is driven by a socially constructed myth or a cultural narrative based on globalization, continuous economic expansion, all aided and abetted by expanding global markets. Perhaps the most ebullient expression of this socially constructed narrative is that of Julian Simon, a management science professor at the late Julian Simon at Maryland University. We have in our hands now the knowledge to feed, clothe, and provide energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years. Not a modest statement. The result of this combination of nature and nurture is that we are currently in a world of overshoot. The human enterprise already exceeds global biocapacity or carrying capacity by, we estimate, about 30%. In late August of this year, we had already that's dangerous. We had already consumed as a species all of the new bioproductivity that will be produced in this year. And for the rest of the year, we are actually drawing down the natural capital stocks. There are fewer fish, less soil, fewer tropical forests, and so on this year than there were last year, and so on down the way. One of the most, I suppose, familiar evidence of this is the changing climate. This graph, if it's up there, it is. It shows this is not a model, don't be concerned that this is the disreputable output of some contrived model. These are real measurement data, and the evidence is quite clear that despite periods in which nothing much seems to be happening, such as between 1940 and 1980, the direction is steadily upwards. And indeed, if this year pans out as it has for the first 6 or 8 months, this 2010 will be the hottest year in the instrumental record, close on the heels of 2005, the previous warmest year. What reason demands in these circumstances, and remember I started out by saying we have this unique capacity for reason and forward planning, is that we avoid the consequences of this continuous upward trajectory. It now looks as if we're going to have great difficulty avoiding 650 parts per billion, or rather million, carbon dioxide equivalents in the atmosphere. That implies a mean global temperature increase on the order of 4 Celsius degrees, totally catastrophic. Unless we can reconcile economic growth with a rapid decline on the order of 6% per year in the use of fossil fuels and therefore carbon emissions, we cannot avoid a catastrophic climate change in this century unless we begin to plan an economic recession. On the other hand, we won't do it. Humankind is not primarily a rational species, as I've tried to emphasize earlier. When our survival or our current status is threatened, or there are emotional issues involved, then instinct and emotion will prevail over reason. And we've known about this for many, many decades. Gustave Le Bon, in a famous text on the nature of the mind, the mind of the crowd, the masses have never thirsted after truth. They turn aside from evidence that is not to their taste, preferring to deify error. 105 years later, Derek Jensen. For us to maintain our way of living, we must tell lies to each other, and especially to ourselves. The lies are necessary because without them, many deplorable acts would become impossibilities. And you can all think of many examples of that in the last century or so. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, there are indeed potions in our bodies and brains capable of forcing on us behaviors that we may or may not be able to suppress by strong resolution. We are a conflicted species, always torn between what intellect says we ought to do and what our instincts and emotions force us to do. Even the poet W.H. Auden recognized, quote, "We are lived by forces we scarcely understand." The bottom line is that we are a culture in deep denial, and we now begin to understand the neurobiological mechanism for this. As an individual grows up in a particular culture and hears repeated ideological statements, for example, or has repeated experiences of one kind or another, this begins to shape the neural circuitry upon which that individual begins to build his philosophy in life. And once that neural circuitry is in shape, subsequently people seek out compatible experiences, and when faced with information that does not agree with their preformed internal structures, this neural circuitry, they deny, discredit, reinterpret, or forget that information. It's a pattern many of us are familiar with. So we're in a situation where we're confronting a gathering storm. The good news is that we actually have the technology to engineer an 80% reduction in material consumption without much change in our lifestyle. The bad news is we do not act. Our politicians and those in control of the policy levers are in paralysis, and the rest of us go along for the ride. The scientifically necessary is politically unfeasible to our culture in denial, but the politically feasible is scientifically irrelevant. Thank you very much.